Have you ever wondered why some people speak perfect English, but sound empty? You hear the grammar, the structure, the accent, everything seems flawless, but somehow the words don't touch you. What if I told you that in Canada, one of the most educated countries in the world, teachers are beginning to ask a simple but profound question: why do Filipinos sound more alive when they speak English than we do? That question haunted Margaret Lewis, a 60-year-old English teacher from Calgary. She had spent nearly 4 decades teaching students how to write essays, pronounce thought instead of taught, and use commas correctly. Her classroom was her kingdom, organized, quiet, predictable. And yet, one morning in early winter, something happened that would shake the very foundation of how she understood her life's work. Her student, a soft-spoken immigrant nurse named Liza, stood up to give her final oral presentation. Margaret had expected the usual stiff posture, memorized lines, eyes glued to the paper. But what came out of Liza's mouth that day was something else. Her words were simple, but her tone carried warmth, rhythm, even melody. She spoke about her grandmother back home in the Philippines, how she used to whisper prayers before dawn, and how those prayers sounded like hope. The entire class went quiet. There was no perfect accent, no fancy vocabulary. But there was something that none of Margaret's polished Canadian students could imitate. When Liza finished, there was silence, then tears, and Margaret herself felt something break open inside her chest. That night, she wrote in her diary, "It wasn't English that moved me. It was the heart inside the English." It was a strange realization for someone who had spent her entire life believing in rules. But rules couldn't explain what she heard. That voice, that Filipino voice, carried honesty, emotion, and faith. It was English, yes, but somehow it felt like it had a soul. Days passed, but the feeling wouldn't leave her. She started searching online, curious to understand how Filipinos learned to speak that way. That's when she discovered something that surprised her. Thousands of Canadians were quietly taking English lessons from teachers in the Philippines. Not from London, not from New York. From Cebu, from Davao, from Manila. At first, she laughed in disbelief. Why would Canadians learn English from Filipinos? She murmured to herself. But as she watched a few of those online classes, her laughter faded. The lessons were not just about language, they were about connection. A young Filipino teacher greeted each student by name, asked about their family, even said a short prayer before class began. The students, mostly middle-aged Canadians like her, weren't just learning how to speak English correctly. They were learning how to feel English deeply. One comment under the video stopped her heart for a moment. "My Filipino tutor taught me more than grammar. She taught me grace." It echoed something Margaret hadn't heard in years, the idea that language could be a form of love. The following week, she joined one of those classes under a fake name, Maggie from Calgary. She told herself it was research, but deep down, she wanted to feel that same warmth she had heard in Liza's voice. The teacher's name was Ate Joy, a cheerful woman from Iloilo with bright eyes and a gentle accent. From the very first minute, Margaret could sense something different. Joy didn't begin with rules or pronunciation drills. She began with a smile and said, "Let's start with something easy. Tell me about something you're grateful for today." Margaret froze. No one had ever asked her that in an English class. She mumbled something about the weather, but Joy smiled and said, "That's beautiful. Now say it again, but slower, like you mean it." They repeated it together until Margaret's voice softened and something inside her began to ease. Over the next weeks, Margaret noticed that she was looking forward to those sessions more than her own classes. Joy would often end the lessons by saying, "English is not just about speaking clearly, it's about speaking kindly." And slowly, Margaret began to see what Canadians had missed all along. The Filipino way of learning wasn't about perfect English. It was about heartfelt English. One evening after class, Margaret asked Joy how she had learned to teach this way. Joy chuckled softly and said, "My mother was a Sunday school teacher. She taught us that every word has power because every word comes from the heart. Maybe that's why Filipinos speak the way we do." That answer stayed with her. It was simple, almost childlike, but it carried a truth Margaret couldn't ignore. For years, she had taught English as if it were a science. But now she realized for Filipinos, English was a prayer, a bridge, a way of connecting souls across oceans. That night, as snow fell outside her window, Margaret replayed Joy's laughter in her head. She opened her laptop and searched again. The results stunned her. Entire Canadian communities from Vancouver to Halifax were now hiring Filipino teachers online. Retired engineers, housewives, even young professionals, all logging into small Zoom classrooms run by teachers from the Philippines. They weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for connection. She leaned back in her chair, whispering to herself, maybe we've been teaching it wrong all along. For the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel like a teacher anymore. She felt like a student again, learning not just a language but a way of life. A way that began thousands of miles away in a country she barely knew, but one that suddenly felt closer than ever. And that was how her quiet journey began. The journey that would lead millions of Canadians just like her to learn English, the Filipino way. The next morning, Margaret woke up earlier than usual. The snow outside was soft, pale and heavy, the kind that silences a whole street. She brewed her coffee, opened her laptop, and stared at the tiny notification from her Filipino teacher. "Good morning, Ma'am Maggie. Are you ready to shine today?" It wasn't much, but it made her smile. The kind of gentle warmth that had become rare in her life. That day's lesson wasn't about grammar or vocabulary. Joy asked her to read a short paragraph, something about gratitude and resilience, and then share what it meant to her. Margaret hesitated, then began reading in her usual steady tone. But halfway through, Joy stopped her gently. "Ma'am Maggie, pause for a moment," she said softly. "When you speak, it's clear. But do you feel the words?" Margaret blinked. "Feel them?" she repeated. Joy nodded. "In the Philippines, when we speak English, we don't just think about what the word means. We think about who we're saying it to, because words are like gifts. You don't just hand them out. You give them with care." It was such a simple statement, but to Margaret it felt like a doorway opening. She realized that in all her years of teaching, she had never thought of words as gifts. They were tools, instruments of precision, never offerings of the heart. After class, she sat quietly watching the snow fall outside her window. She began to think of all the times she had corrected her students' pronunciation, the way she used to say, "No, that's not how a native speaker says it," or "Your accent is too strong." She had never realized how much those corrections might have silenced someone's voice. Suddenly it felt cruel, the way she had prized perfection over personality. Later that evening, she joined a Facebook group for Canadians learning English with Filipino tutors. It was filled with thousands of members, retirees, business professionals, parents, all sharing stories. One woman wrote, "I've been speaking English all my life, but my Filipino tutor made me love speaking it." Another man shared, "When I talk to my teacher from Davao, she listens to me like I'm her brother. I didn't just learn English, I learned compassion." Margaret scrolled for hours, reading each story with growing awe. She began noticing a pattern. People weren't describing lessons, they were describing relationships. And almost every Filipino teacher was described with the same words: patient, kind, encouraging, genuine. It was as if the entire nation had somehow turned teaching English into an act of love. Curiosity turned into fascination. She began researching the history of English in the Philippines. She learned how, after centuries of colonization and cultural blending, the Filipino people had turned language into something uniquely their own. Not borrowed, not forced, but woven. English wasn't just a foreign tongue there. It had become part of the Filipino soul, shaped by faith, warmth, and resilience. The next day, Margaret asked Joy a question that had been burning in her mind. "Why do you think so many Filipinos become English teachers?" Joy smiled thoughtfully. "Because English became part of our story. We use it to connect with the world, but we never lose ourselves in it. It's like singing someone else's song, but with our own melody." Margaret found herself writing those words down. That evening, she couldn't stop thinking about what Joy had said. She remembered the way Liza, her Filipino student, had spoken about her grandmother in her final presentation, every word wrapped in tenderness. Maybe that was what made the Filipino voice so unique. It wasn't trying to sound perfect. It was trying to sound human. Over the next few weeks, Margaret began to notice subtle changes in herself. She stopped correcting her students as often. She started listening, really listening to the tone behind their words. One day, a young immigrant from Syria struggled to describe his feelings about winter in Canada. Instead of interrupting, she simply said, "Take your time. I want to understand what you feel." The boy smiled, took a deep breath, and found the right words. When he finished, he whispered, "Thank you for waiting, teacher." It was the first time in years that Margaret felt proud, not because her student spoke correctly, but because he spoke sincerely. After class, she sent a message to Joy. "You're changing the way I teach, and maybe even the way I live." Joy replied with a simple line that made her heart swell. "Then maybe you're learning the Filipino way." Margaret started journaling every night after that. She wrote about how her lessons with Joy felt more like conversations than classes. How every time Joy laughed, it reminded her that learning didn't have to be heavy. How every mistake was met with kindness instead of criticism. She even wrote, "In Canada, we teach English to climb higher. In the Philippines, they teach it to reach hearts." As weeks turned into months, Margaret began sharing her experiences with her colleagues at the local community college. At first, they were skeptical. "Filipino teachers?" one of them asked with a doubtful smile. "You mean the ones teaching online for cheap rates?" Margaret didn't argue. She simply said, "You should hear how they teach. It's not about the price, it's about the presence." Eventually, a few of them grew curious enough to try it themselves. Within weeks, they too began sharing stories of unexpected joy, laughter, prayer, and connection that transcended screens. One colleague even told her, "My Filipino tutor remembered my cat's name. No one's ever done that for me before." It was small things like that, remembering, caring, listening, that built bridges between two worlds. Slowly, quietly, Filipinos were teaching Canadians something far greater than grammar. They were teaching them humanity. One snowy evening, as Margaret watched the flickering lights of Calgary's downtown skyline, she thought about how strange it was that an island nation thousands of miles away was reshaping her city's classrooms, one heart at a time. She wondered if this was just the beginning, if more people around the world would soon discover what she had found. She closed her eyes and whispered softly, "The world doesn't need more perfect speakers. It needs more kind ones." And somewhere across the ocean, a Filipino teacher named Joy smiled at a screen, teaching another Canadian how to say not just the right words, but the right way to say them. When the invitation first arrived, Margaret thought it was a mistake. "Ma'am Maggie, if you ever come to the Philippines, I would love to meet you in Iloilo," Joy had written, ending her message with a smiley face. Margaret had smiled too, thinking, what a sweet idea, but impossible. She was 61, a widow. Her knees ached when she walked too far, and she hadn't been on a plane in almost 2 decades. But somehow, the thought of meeting Joy, the woman who had quietly transformed her life, kept echoing in her mind like a soft call she couldn't ignore. One late spring evening, as she watched a video of Filipino teachers singing with their students online, something stirred inside her. The song was "You Raise Me Up," and the voices, tender, imperfect, full of faith, filled her room with a kind of light she hadn't felt in years. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Maybe it's time I go." A few weeks later, she was standing at the Ninoy Aquino International Airport, her suitcase wobbling, her heart pounding with the awkward excitement of a child. The moment the glass doors opened, she was hit by the warmth. Not just the humid air, but the warmth of faces. Everyone seemed to be smiling. A security guard helped her with her luggage. A stranger offered her bottled water. And the family waiting nearby greeted her with a cheerful, "Welcome to the Philippines, ma'am." Margaret was stunned. In Canada, people avoided eye contact in airports. Here, everyone seemed connected by invisible threads of kindness. A few hours later, her connecting flight landed in Iloilo, Joy's hometown. As the plane descended, Margaret pressed her hand against the window, looking down at the lush green fields, the curved rivers, and the glimmering sea. There was something sacred in the way the light touched the land. Maybe that's why they speak the way they do, she thought. They live surrounded by grace. Joy was waiting at the small airport, waving enthusiastically, holding a cardboard sign that said, "Welcome, Ma'am Maggie," decorated with hand-drawn hearts. When Margaret saw her, she froze for a moment. The woman she had only known through a glowing laptop screen was real, smaller than she expected, wearing a simple yellow blouse, eyes filled with the same light that had traveled across oceans. They hugged without words. "I can't believe you came," Joy said, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't believe it either," Margaret replied, laughing through tears. "You're shorter than on camera," Joy laughed. "And you're taller, but your voice, it's still the same, kind and curious." They drove through the city in a tricycle, the wind brushing against their faces. Everywhere Margaret looked, she saw color. Jeepneys painted like moving rainbows, vendors selling mangoes under bright umbrellas, children chasing each other barefoot. It was chaotic, yet somehow peaceful, like a song with no conductor, but perfect harmony. Joy took her to her small home by the sea, where her mother greeted her with the traditional Filipino gesture, taking Margaret's hand and pressing it to her forehead. "God bless you," the woman said in soft English. Margaret felt tears welling up again. She had never been welcomed like this, not by family, not even in church. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset melt into the horizon, Joy brewed coffee and told her stories. She spoke about how her family survived typhoons, how neighbors helped rebuild each other's homes, how everyone learned to smile through storms. "In the Philippines," Joy said, looking at the sky, "we don't separate language from life. We speak with the same heart we use to pray, to laugh, to love. That's why when we teach English, we don't just teach words. We teach hope." Margaret listened, her eyes glistening. She realized that Joy wasn't just describing a culture. She was describing a faith that lived in the everyday. She thought of her own students back home, how distant and mechanical her classes had sometimes felt. Maybe that's what's missing, she thought. We forgot the human part of teaching. The next morning, Joy took her to a small rural school. The building was simple, wooden walls, tin roof, children sitting on benches that looked older than the teachers. But what struck Margaret wasn't the lack of resources. It was the abundance of spirit. The students greeted her with a chorus of "Good morning, Ma'am Margaret," followed by laughter and applause. During one of the classes, a little girl stood up to read aloud in English. Her accent was thick, her pronunciation imperfect, but her eyes shone with pride. When she finished, everyone clapped, not because she was flawless, but because she was brave. Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. She whispered to Joy, This is what we've lost in Canada. We don't clap for courage anymore." Joy smiled. "In our schools, we don't wait for perfection to celebrate. We celebrate progress. That's the Filipino way." After class, the children surrounded Margaret, asking about snow and Christmas lights in Canada. One boy tugged at her sleeve and asked shyly, "Do you like the Philippines, ma'am?" Margaret knelt down, meeting his eyes. "I think," she said softly, "the Philippines just taught me how to speak again." That night, Joy's family held a small dinner for her. There was adobo, pancit, halo, and endless laughter. They prayed before eating, holding hands around the table. As they bowed their heads, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years, belonging. When it was her turn to speak, she said, "I came here to learn how you teach English. But I think I'm learning how you live, with kindness, with faith, and with joy. Maybe that's what the world needs right now." Joy reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "That's what we've been trying to tell the world all along." Outside, the night air was thick with the smell of salt and jasmine. In the distance, a choir from the nearby church began to sing. Margaret listened quietly. The words were in Tagalog, but somehow she understood. It was the same message Joy had been teaching her all along, that language isn't about fluency, it's about feeling. As the stars rose above the sea, Margaret realized that this trip wasn't just about discovering how millions of Canadians were learning English the Filipino way. It was about discovering why. Because sometimes the world doesn't need new lessons. It just needs old truths spoken from a new heart. The plane touched down in Calgary under a sky of pale grey clouds. The air felt sharp and empty compared to the warm, forgiving humidity of the Philippines. As Margaret stepped off the plane, she felt as though she had just left behind a dream that was still breathing somewhere over the Pacific. She carried only a small suitcase, a few gifts from Joy's family, a hand-woven fan, a rosary, and a small wooden sign that said, "Teach with the heart, not the tongue." It was written in careful looping letters, the kind only a Filipino grandmother could have drawn. She held it close to her chest as she walked through the airport. Back home, her apartment felt unusually quiet. No one greeted her at the door. No laughter from Joy, no distant sound of waves. But something inside her had changed, a calm that she couldn't explain. That night she unpacked her things and placed the wooden sign on her desk, right beside her stack of textbooks. She stared at it for a long time, whispering, "Let's see if I can do this." The next morning she stood before her class, 30 students, most of them young Canadians from middle-class families, staring blankly at their screens and notebooks. It was the same routine she had lived for years, but this time she felt like a stranger in her own kingdom. "Good morning," she began softly. "Today I want to try something different." The students looked up, curious but indifferent. She smiled, the kind of gentle, patient smile she had learned from Joy, and said, "Before we start, I want everyone to write down one thing they're grateful for. Not in fancy words, just honestly." A murmur spread through the room. "Grateful? Like a diary?" one student asked, half laughing. "Yes," Margaret said, nodding. "Like a diary, but for your heart, not your grammar." The room went quiet. Slowly, pens began to move. A few students hesitated, others scribbled quickly. When Margaret asked if anyone wanted to share, no one raised a hand until a shy girl named Hannah whispered, "I'm grateful for my mum. She's sick, but she still wakes up early to pack my lunch." The class fell silent again. The usual restlessness, the checking of phones, the tapping of pens stopped. Margaret felt something shift in the room, something she hadn't felt in years. It was small, fragile, but real. She smiled softly. "Thank you, Hannah," she said. "That's perfect English, not because of the words, but because it's true." From that day on, she changed everything. Grammar drills became conversations. Vocabulary lessons turned into reflections. Instead of saying, "Repeat after me," she began saying, "Say it as if you mean it." She started each class with a prayer. Not a religious one, but a quiet moment of gratitude, the way Joy did. At first, her colleagues thought she had lost her mind. "Margaret, are you teaching English or running therapy sessions?" One of them joked, but Margaret didn't mind. She knew what she had seen and what she had felt in those humble Filipino classrooms. She brought out the wooden sign one day and showed it to her students. "This was given to me by a teacher in the Philippines," she said. "She told me that to teach English well, you must teach with the heart, not the tongue. I want you all to remember that." Something about those words stayed with them. Slowly, her classroom began to change. Students who rarely spoke started opening up. A boy who used to skip class came early, bringing coffee for her. One afternoon, as they discussed storytelling, another student said, "Miss Lewis, you sound different lately." Margaret laughed. "Do I?" "Yeah," he said, smiling. "It's like you care more about what we're trying to say than how we say it." She nodded gently. "That's because I learned that good English is not about being perfect. It's about being understood. And to be understood, you must first listen, not with your ears, but with your heart." Over the next few months, her classroom became something rare, a place of honesty. Students began writing essays not to impress her, but to express themselves. One wrote about his parents' divorce, another about her grandmother's death. Their writing was messy, full of errors, but alive, raw, real, and filled with meaning. Word spread around the college. Other teachers began to visit her class, curious about what she was doing differently. Some stayed silent, watching, others asked questions. One day during a faculty meeting, the head of the English department said, "Margaret's students show unusual engagement this term. Whatever she's doing, it's working." She smiled politely, But in her heart she whispered, "It's not me, it's Joy." That night she wrote to Joy again. "You won't believe this. My students are changing. I think they're beginning to speak with their hearts." Joy replied the next morning, "Then Canada is learning to listen. I told you it starts with one teacher, one story, one act of kindness." That message made Margaret cry. She realized that what Joy had taught her wasn't just a method. It was a movement, one that didn't need headlines or fame, just faith. Weeks later, something remarkable happened. Her college invited her to speak at a small education conference in Toronto. They wanted her to present the Filipino way of teaching English. When she stood on the stage, she looked out at the audience, teachers, educators, scholars, and for the first time, she didn't feel nervous. She began by asking them, "Have you ever been moved by someone who spoke broken English, yet touched your heart more than a native speaker ever could?" Dozens of hands went up. "Then you already know what I'm talking about," she said. "Because that's the Filipino way. They don't just teach you how to speak English. They teach you how to feel it, and that changes everything." The room filled with gentle applause as the session ended. A few teachers approached her, asking how they could learn more about online Filipino tutors. Some were curious about possible collaborations. What started as a simple discussion slowly turned into meaningful connections between learning communities across countries. That evening, as snow softly covered the sidewalks, Margaret stood by her window. She thought of a small classroom far away, of bright smiles, shy voices, and the courage of children learning something new. She whispered to herself, "It's amazing how small moments can change everything." And for the first time, she felt proud, not because of perfect grammar, but because of kindness. Weeks later, in the early days of spring, Margaret received an email with the subject, "Project Approved HeartSpeak Pilot Program." She opened it carefully. It confirmed that an educational collaboration inspired by Filipino teaching values would soon begin. What once started as a personal exchange had grown into a meaningful learning initiative, encouraging kindness and empathy in communication. She leaned back, emotional. The words didn't matter as much as what they meant. A simple human connection had become something bigger. That night, she called Joy. Joy's familiar smile appeared on the screen. "You look so happy," Joy laughed. Margaret smiled back. "I've learned to appreciate small joys more now." They talked for hours. Margaret explained how online teachers would now help guide students and educators, not only in language learning, but emotional understanding. She shared the project name, Project HeartSpeak, a program designed to teach communication with compassion. Joy gently covered her mouth. "That's beautiful," she said softly. A few months later, Margaret attended a learning conference, not as a guest, but as a mentor. Teachers from different countries joined through video calls, sharing ideas about positive communication and student well-being. A speaker shared, "When we teach language, we teach connection. We want students to feel safe expressing themselves." The room became very quiet. Many people felt inspired. Over time, the project grew. Online workshops helped teachers learn how to correct gently, encourage confidently, and listen with patience. Students felt safer. Classrooms became more positive. Learning became enjoyable again. For the first time, many students said, "I feel understood." News outlets began to take notice. One morning, Margaret turned on her television to find a headline that made her laugh through tears. "Canada learns from the Philippines. How Filipino teachers are changing the way we speak." The story featured interviews with several students who described how their Filipino tutors had changed their lives. One young woman said, "My teacher from Manila taught me not to fear mistakes. She said every wrong word can still be right if you mean it with love." Another man shared, "Before I thought English was just a skill. Now I see it's a way to connect hearts." As she listened, Margaret realized something extraordinary. People weren't just learning English anymore. They were learning empathy through language. That evening, she went for a walk in her neighborhood park. The snow was melting, revealing the first signs of grass beneath. Children were playing, their laughter echoing in the crisp air. She thought of the children in Iloilo, the way they clapped for courage, And suddenly, it felt as if the world had become smaller, not by technology, but by tenderness. She sat on a bench, took out her phone, and typed a message to Joy. "You said once that language is a gift. I think the Philippines just gave a gift to the world." Minutes later, Joy replied with a photo of her students smiling and waving. Beneath it, she had written, "And we're happy the world finally opened it." Margaret stared at that picture for a long time. The joy on those young faces, the simplicity, the sincerity, it was everything she had been trying to bring back home. She realized that what made the Filipino way so powerful wasn't just culture or religion or teaching style. It was faith, faith in the goodness of people, faith that kindness still mattered, faith that even small voices could echo across oceans. In her final semester before retirement, Margaret began every class with the same words: speak with truth, speak with love, speak the Filipino way. One day after her last lecture, her students surprised her with a small ceremony. They had printed a large photo of Joy and her students, framed with the words, "From Iloilo to Calgary. Thank you for teaching us how to feel English." She couldn't hold back her tears. When she spoke, her voice trembled, but her message was clear. "For years I thought I was teaching English, but now I understand it was teaching me, and I will never forget who my true teachers were." As she left the classroom for the last time, she paused by the door, looking back at the wooden sign from Joy. She smiled softly and whispered, "We did it." Outside, the wind was gentle, and the late afternoon sun painted the sky gold. Somewhere, she imagined, a Filipino teacher was starting another online class, greeting her students with that same unshakable warmth. "Good morning. Are you ready to shine today?" And somewhere across Canada, in quiet homes, in classrooms, in hearts, people were answering, not just in English, but in kindness. Because that's what the Filipino way had always been. Not a method, not a miracle, but a reminder that when you teach with love, even language becomes a prayer. And prayers always find their way.